I found the photo 11 days before I found out what it meant. That's the part one still can't get past. How long I carried it around not knowing. My name is Ethan. I'm 34, an architect at a mid-sized firm downtown. And until the night of October the 4th, I would have told you my marriage was the one thing in my life I never had to think about. 7 years with Melissa. No drama, no separate bank accounts, no history of anyone straying. At least none I knew about. We had a townhouse on Larkspur Street with a kitchen island she picked out and I paid too much for. And on Friday nights we usually ordered Thai food and watched something neither of us cared about. That Friday was different. Melissa came downstairs in a black dress I didn't recognize, the kind with a slit that made me look twice, and told me Priya was dragging her out for her birthday. Priya had been Melissa's closest friend since college. Loud, funny, the kind of woman who organized brunches and remembered everyone's astrological sign. A club night wasn't out of character for Priya. It was out of character for my wife, who usually needed 40 minutes of convincing just to go to a work dinner. "You look nice," I said, and meant it, and also felt something small and unnamed tighten in my chest, the kind of feeling you dismiss because naming it seems paranoid, seems like an accusation you have no right to make. She kissed me on the cheek, grabbed her clutch, and said she'd be home by 1. I watched her taillights pull out of the driveway and told myself I was being ridiculous. She was allowed to have a night out. 7 years in, I still trusted her completely. That trust wasn't a decision I made each day, it was just the ground I stood on. I fell asleep on the couch around midnight with the television murmuring to itself. When I woke up, it was almost 3, and Melissa was standing in the hallway with her shoes in one hand, mascara smudged in dark half-moons under her eyes, and an expression I'd never seen on her before, somewhere between panic and exhaustion, like she'd been running from something invisible. "Hey," I said, sitting up too fast, my neck stiff from the couch cushion. "You're late. Everything okay?" "Fine," she said, too quickly, the word clipped short at both ends. "Long night. I'm going to bed." She didn't smell like herself. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. A cologne that wasn't mine, sweet and unfamiliar, tangled into the perfume she'd left the house wearing. I told myself it was probably just the club, secondhand smoke, and other people's colognes on tight dance floors. I told myself a lot of things that night. What I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't understand for another 11 days, was that in the parking lot of that club, 20 minutes before she walked through our door, my wife had kissed another man against the hood of his car and had already started rehearsing, in her head, the version of the night she was going to tell me. I followed her upstairs. She was already in bed, back to me, breathing in that too-even way people breathe when they're pretending to be asleep. I lay down beside her and stared at the ceiling for a long time, listening to the house settle the way it always did. The radiator ticking in the hallway, the neighbor's dog barking twice and going quiet. Ordinary sounds. I remember thinking, almost angrily at myself, that a house this ordinary couldn't possibly be hiding anything. That was the kind of logic I ran on that whole first week. The idea that peace and betrayal couldn't physically occupy the same space, the same walls, the same Tuesday. In the morning, she was quieter than usual over coffee, scrolling her phone with her thumb moving faster than her eyes could have actually been reading. I asked if she'd had a good time. "It was fine," she said. And then, unprompted, Priya got really drunk. I mostly just watched her. It was a small detail, offered without my asking for it. The kind of unnecessary specificity people add when they're building a story they want to sound complete. I didn't know that yet. I just filed it away, the way you file away a receipt you don't think you'll need. I want to say clearly, before this story goes any further, that none of this felt sinister in the moment. It felt like Tuesday. It felt like the ordinary friction of two people living together, the kind every marriage absorbs without noticing. That's what makes it dangerous in hindsight. Not that the signs were hidden, but that they were dressed exactly like nothing. I didn't know it yet, but that smudged mascara wasn't the strangest thing I'd noticed about her that month. It wasn't even close. The next morning, Melissa was already gone by the time I came downstairs, a note on the counter saying she'd gone for a run, which she never did on Saturdays. I stood in the kitchen holding my coffee, looking at her handwriting like it might tell me something her voice hadn't. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters for everything that comes after. I didn't ask her about that night. Not that morning, not that week. I told myself I was giving her space, being the kind of husband who doesn't interrogate his wife over one late evening. The truth is smaller and less flattering than that. I didn't ask because some part of me didn't want the answer. Asking would have made the feeling in my chest real, and as long as I didn't ask, I could keep living in the version of my marriage where nothing was wrong. That was my blind spot, if I'm being honest with you now. I trusted Melissa so completely, for so long, that questioning her felt like a betrayal in itself, like I'd be the one breaking something. So instead, I watched, quietly, without admitting that's what I was doing. Over the next 2 weeks, small things accumulated the way small things do, not evidence yet, just texture. Melissa started keeping her phone face down on the counter, which she'd never done before. When it buzzed, her hand would move toward it a half-second faster than seemed natural, like a reflex she hadn't had a month earlier. She mentioned Priya's name more than usual, a coffee here, a work thing there. And every time I asked a follow-up question, she'd answer fast and then change the subject, the way you skip past a bruise when someone reaches for it. My sister Dana was going through her own divorce that autumn, and some nights Melissa and I would sit with a bottle of wine and talk about how sad it was, how Dana's husband had just checked out of the marriage for a year before anyone noticed. Melissa was unusually invested in those conversations. She'd ask Dana questions I wouldn't have thought to ask. When did you know something was wrong? Did you ever suspect? What would you have wanted him to say? At the time, I thought she was just being a good sister-in-law. Looking back, I think she was asking on behalf of someone else entirely. Herself. There's a specific kind of quiet that settles over a house when one person in it is keeping a secret. You can't point to it. You just feel the air pressure change. One Tuesday, I came home early and found her on the back porch, phone pressed to her ear, laughing in a low voice I didn't recognize. Not her work laugh, not her laugh with me, something lower and more private. When she saw me through the glass door, she said, "I have to go," into the phone so fast the words ran together. And by the time I stepped outside, she was already scrolling her email like nothing had happened. "Who was that?" I asked. "Priya," she said, not looking up. "She's having a thing with her landlord." I let it go. That was the pattern now. I let things go, one at a time, each one small enough to swallow on its own, and I didn't notice I was building a stomach full of things I hadn't digested. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever caught yourself explaining away a feeling because the alternative was too frightening to sit with, you already know what that felt like. It isn't stupidity. It's self-preservation dressed up as patience. Around that same time, my sister Dana came over for dinner, freshly separated, still raw about it in a way that made the whole evening heavier than it needed to be. She kept apologizing for bringing the mood down, and Melissa kept telling her not to apologize, that she deserved to feel however she felt. At one point, Dana said, half laughing, half not, "The worst part is I keep wondering what I missed. Like there had to have been signs, and I just wasn't looking." Melissa went very still for a second. I noticed it because it was so unlike her, a half-beat where she seemed to forget to keep breathing normally. And then she reached over and squeezed Dana's hand and said something comforting about hindsight always being unfair to the person living through it in real time. I remember thinking, at the time, what a good friend she was being. I didn't think, not once, to wonder why the comment had landed on her the way it clearly had. Chris came by that same week to help me put together a bookshelf, and somewhere between the second and third shelf he asked, out of nowhere, "Everything good with you two?" I said yes, mostly on reflex, and he gave me a look I didn't examine closely enough at the time. Not suspicion exactly, more like the look of a friend who's noticed you've gotten quieter than usual and isn't sure whether to push. I brushed past it. I told him things were fine, because as far as I could put into words, they were. The following week, Melissa announced she and Priya were doing a girls' trip to the coast for a long weekend. Priya's idea, a rental house. Nothing unusual for two friends who'd been taking trips together since their 20s. I drove her to the airport shuttle stop myself, kissed her goodbye, told her to send pictures. I told myself, much later, what she was actually living through that weekend. This is what she told me, in her own words, once everything had already come apart. I keep telling myself this is the last time. I keep saying that like it means something, like saying it enough times will make it true, instead of just another lie I tell myself between the real ones. Marcus texted me before I even landed, counting down, and my stomach dropped in a way that used to feel like excitement and now just felt like falling. I told Priya I needed air on the balcony, and I stood out there for 20 minutes with my phone in my hand, not typing anything, just holding it like it might explode. I kept thinking about Ethan's face when he dropped me at the shuttle. He trusts me so completely, it's almost unbearable. That's the part nobody warns you about. How much easier it would be if he suspected something. His trust doesn't feel like safety anymore. It feels like a debt I can't stop adding to. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. As far as I was concerned, she was on a beach with her college roommate, and I spent that weekend repainting the guest room and feeling, for the first time in months, like maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. She came home from that trip sunburned across her shoulders and unusually affectionate, the way people are when they're trying to prove something to themselves as much as to you. I remember thinking, with something close to relief, that whatever strange static had been running through our marriage that fall had finally cleared. I had no idea the static hadn't cleared at all. It had just gone quiet for a moment, the way a storm sometimes stalls before it gets worse. November came in gray and early. The thing about suspicion, once it takes root, is that it doesn't behave like a single thought. It behaves like weather. Some days it's nothing, blue sky, and I'd catch myself laughing with Melissa over something stupid on TV and think, see, you were imagining things. Other days it pressed down on everything, and I'd watch her face for a beat too long across the dinner table, and she'd say, "What?" with an edge in her voice that hadn't been there a year ago. The first real crack came from something almost absurdly small. Melissa had left her laptop open on the kitchen counter while she showered, and I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to how the next part of my life unfolded. I was just closing tabs so I could check a work email. And there, in her browser history, was a name I didn't know. A photo-sharing folder called Simply M. I didn't open it. I told myself it was probably nothing. An old file from a trip, a work project, a coworker's initials. I closed the laptop and didn't mention it, and hated myself a little for not mentioning it, and told myself that not mentioning it was its own kind of proof that I already suspected the worst. That was the moment. If I'm honest with you now, looking back, that was the first time I truly started to doubt. Not the vague unease of October, but something colder and more specific. I called it nothing at the time. I wouldn't call it nothing anymore. A few days later, Melissa mentioned, almost too casually, that she'd run into an old coworker at a coffee shop downtown. Someone named Marcus, from a marketing job she'd left 3 years earlier. She said it the way you mentioned someone unimportant, folding his name into a sentence about oat milk being out of stock. I only remember it now because of what came after. At the time, it slid past me like 100 other names she'd mentioned that year. I started noticing the phone thing had gotten worse. She'd taken to charging it in the bathroom instead of on her nightstand. A habit she explained as "the light keeps me up," which might even have been true, except that she'd never cared about the light in 7 years of charging it exactly where it had always been. Priya came over for dinner that week, and something in the dynamic between them fell off in a way I couldn't name. Too many meaningful glances, too many sentences that started and then got redirected. At one point Melissa said, "Priya, don't," under her breath, and Priya's face did something complicated. Guilt, maybe, or fear, or both, before she laughed it off and changed the subject to a show we'd all been watching. I asked Melissa about it later, once Priya had gone home. What was that about with Priya? Nothing. She was going to tell an embarrassing story about my birthday. I stopped her. Melissa said it lightly, already halfway up the stairs, already ending the conversation before it had properly started. I didn't ask again. That was another one of the moments I'd give almost anything to have back. Not because asking again would necessarily have gotten me the truth, but because not asking had become, by then, a kind of complicity. I was choosing the comfortable lie over the uncomfortable question, and some part of me had started to understand that I was doing it on purpose. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from living inside a marriage where you've started keeping your suspicions to yourself the same way your spouse is keeping her secrets to herself. Two people in one house, each quietly managing a private truth, each performing normalcy for the other's benefit. Maybe you've lived inside a version of that kind of quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It just gets a little heavier every week. That weekend we went to Dana's for a small get-together. Nothing formal, just family sitting around her living room with takeout containers on the coffee table. At one point Melissa excused herself to take a call and was gone for almost 20 minutes, long enough that Dana asked, lightly, if everything was okay with her. I said it was probably work. When Melissa came back, her eyes were slightly red, and she said the call had been about a difficult client and that she needed a minute before rejoining the conversation. I remember reaching for her hand under the table and how she let me hold it without quite holding back, like her hand was there, but the rest of her had stayed out on that call. Later that night, driving home, she was unusually talkative, asking about my work, about a project deadline I'd mentioned weeks earlier, and she'd apparently remembered in detail, asking if I was happy, actually happy, in a tone that seemed to want a specific answer rather than the automatic one. I said yes, of course, and asked why she was asking. No reason, she said. I just wanted to hear you say it. I didn't understand, at the time, that I was being quietly measured against something or someone she hadn't told me about yet. The Friday after that, Melissa said she was staying late at the office for a client deadline. I drove past her building around 8, telling myself I was just picking up dinner nearby, and her car wasn't in the garage. It wasn't proof of anything. Client dinners happened off-site all the time. But I sat in my car outside the empty space where her car should have been for almost 10 minutes, and something in me went very quiet and very cold, the way a house goes quiet right before a storm knocks the power out. When she got home at 11, smelling faintly of a restaurant I couldn't place, she told me the dinner had run long, that her phone had died, that she was sorry she hadn't called. I said it was fine. I made her tea. I told myself, one more time, that I was being paranoid. I didn't know it yet, but her phone hadn't died at all. It was sitting in her bag the entire time, and the last message on it, sent 40 minutes before she walked through our door, was 3 words long, and it wasn't from Priya. I'd like to tell you I found what I found because I was clever. The truth is closer to the opposite. I found it because I finally stopped protecting myself from looking. It started with the folder. 2 weeks after I'd first seen it and talked myself out of opening it, Melissa left her laptop unlocked again. This time on purpose, I think now, some subconscious part of her almost daring the truth to surface. The way people sometimes leave a door unlocked when they're tired of holding it shut. I opened the folder called M. It wasn't what I expected. It wasn't explicit, wasn't damning on its own, just photos. A man's hand on a car window. A view from a hotel balcony I didn't recognize. A screenshot of a text thread, cropped so only the first few lines showed. Something about missing someone's voice. And one photo, clearly taken by accident, half of a man's face caught in a mirror behind Melissa's shoulder, dark hair, a jaw I didn't know, laughing at something outside the frame. I sat with that folder open for a long time before I closed it and did nothing. That was my mistake, if we're naming mistakes honestly. Not the trust I'd extended for 7 years, which I don't regret, but the version of myself that saw evidence and still needed more of it before I could let myself believe it. I told myself I needed to be sure. What I actually needed was time to prepare for a truth I already knew. I called Chris that night, my closest friend since college, the only person I trusted enough to say the sentence out loud. I think Melissa's seeing someone. I told him, sitting in my car outside his apartment because I couldn't say it inside my own house. Chris didn't tell me I was crazy. He didn't tell me to confront her immediately, either. He just said, get sure first. Don't let her talk you out of something you already know. Over the next 10 days I did what I never imagined I'd become the kind of person who did. I checked the shared photo backup we'd both forgotten was still syncing from an old family plan, an account Melissa had stopped thinking about years ago. Buried in it were deleted photos that hadn't fully deleted, cached before she'd cleared them from her phone. A message thread, partial, from someone saved only as M, work in her contacts, though I now knew there was no work left to discuss. A hotel receipt, forwarded to an email she rarely checked, dated the same weekend as her coast trip with Priya for a room in a hotel 40 minutes from the coast house, not at it. The pieces didn't fit together cleanly. Some were red herrings I chased for days before I understood they meant nothing. A strange charge on our joint account that turned out to be a birthday gift for me, hidden out of thoughtfulness rather than guilt. A late-night call from an unknown number that turned out to be a wrong number, not Marcus at all. I want to be honest that not everything I suspected was true. Some of my paranoia that month latched onto things that had nothing to do with the actual betrayal. And I said things to Melissa in passing, sharp, accusatory things about a coworker's name on her calendar that had no basis at all. That was my own failure, a small cruelty I owe an apology for even now, even knowing everything I later learned. Being wronged doesn't give you the right to wrong someone in return, even in small ways, even out of fear. There was a night, in the middle of all this, when I almost told Melissa everything I'd found, not out of courage, but out of exhaustion. I'd been carrying the weight of the receipt and the folder and the deleted messages for 4 days without saying a word, and it had started to poison the way I looked at her across the dinner table, the way I flinched slightly when she touched my shoulder. She noticed. She asked, more than once, if something was wrong, and each time I said no, I was just tired from work, and each time I watched something like relief pass behind her eyes, relief that I think, looking back, was less about believing me and more about being granted one more day before the truth arrived. Chris talked me down from confronting her that week without being fully sure yet. "You've got a receipt and a photo," he said. "That's not nothing, but you want to know the whole shape of it before you walk in there, or she's going to control the story the second you open your mouth." He was right, and I hated that he was right, because it meant more days of sitting on a truth that was already unbearable to carry alone. But the hotel receipt was real, and once I had that, the rest came into focus with a speed that frightened me. I called Priya. I don't know why I thought she'd tell me the truth. Maybe because I'd run out of other people to ask, maybe because some part of me had noticed that dinner weeks earlier, the way guilt had moved across her face like weather. She didn't answer at first. When she finally called back, 2 days later, her voice was different, smaller, tired, like she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally set it down. "I told her she needed to tell you," Priya said, before I'd even finished my question. "I told her weeks ago. I'm sorry, Ethan. I should have told you myself. I didn't think it was my place, and then I kept thinking that every day, and it just kept not being my place, until it was too late to say anything without it looking like I'd been lying to you the whole time." Which I guess I had been. This is what Melissa told me, much later, about the pressure Priya had put on her that same week, the version I didn't have access to as it was happening. Priya cornered me in my own kitchen and said if I didn't end it, she was going to end our friendship, not tell Ethan herself, just walk away from 10 years of knowing me. I told her I would end it. I meant it when I said it. I even believed it for about 6 hours. Then Marcus texted me a photo of the coast at sunset and asked if I remembered the balcony, and I felt that same pull I'd been telling myself I could control, and I realized I didn't actually want to stop. I just wanted to stop feeling guilty about not stopping. Those aren't the same thing, and it took me embarrassingly long to understand the difference. That's what she told me. At the time, all I knew was that Priya sounded like a woman confessing to something, and that my wife had known, for weeks, exactly what she was doing to me. I didn't confront Melissa that night. I sat in the driveway for almost an hour with the hotel receipt printed out on the passenger seat beside me, and I thought about the black dress, and the mascara, and the cologne that wasn't mine, and every single time over the past 6 weeks that I had chosen comfort over the truth. I didn't know it yet, but the confrontation I was building toward in my head, calm, controlled, evidence laid out like a closing argument, wasn't anything like the conversation we were actually going to have. I waited until Saturday morning, when we'd both had coffee and neither of us had anywhere to be. I'd rehearsed it a dozen ways in the shower, in the car, lying awake at 3 in the morning, but when I finally sat down across from Melissa at our kitchen table, all the careful language dissolved, and what came out was simpler than I expected. "Who's Marcus?" I watched something in her face fall apart in real time. Not surprise, exactly. Relief, almost. Like she'd been waiting 7 weeks for someone to finally ask her the question directly. "Ethan." "Don't," I said. "Don't do the thing where you ask what I mean. I found the hotel receipt. I found the folder on your laptop. I talked to Priya. I know there's a Marcus. I need you to tell me the truth, all of it, right now, or I'm going to start assuming the worst version of everything, and I don't think you want that." She was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug like she needed something to hold on to. "It was one kiss," she said finally. "That night at the club. It wasn't supposed to be anything. The hotel receipt says otherwise." Her face crumpled. Okay, it wasn't one kiss. It's been going on since September. Marcus, we used to work together, and we reconnected, and I know how that sounds. I know exactly how that sounds, and I hate myself for it. But I need you to understand it wasn't about you. It was never about you not being enough. Then what was it about? My voice cracked on the last word, and I hated that it did. Hated that 7 weeks of careful control gave out in front of her at the exact moment I needed it most. I don't know how to explain it in a way that doesn't sound like an excuse. Try. She looked at me for a long time, and something in her shoulders dropped, like she'd finally stopped holding the shape of the lie she'd been carrying. What came next? I remember almost word for word, because I've replayed it more times than I can count. It started small, she said. The club that night. I wasn't even planning to talk to him. He was just there, and something about seeing someone from a completely different part of my life, someone who didn't know me as your wife or Priya's friend, someone who just saw me as, I don't know, as myself. Before any of this, it felt like air after being underwater. We kissed in the parking lot, and I told myself it was a one-time thing, a birthday night mistake, and I almost believed it. I told myself that for maybe 4 days. Then he texted me, and I told myself answering once wasn't the same as continuing anything. Every single time. Ethan, I told myself this specific lie, that this one time didn't count, that I could stop whenever I wanted, that the fact I felt guilty proved I was still a good person underneath it. I used the guilt as proof I hadn't really become someone else. I know now that's backwards. The guilt didn't stop me from doing it again. It just made the doing it worse, because I always knew. The trip to the coast. Priya didn't know at first, not the whole trip. I told her I needed cover for one dinner, and she assumed it was harmless, and I let her assume that. By the time she found out how far it had actually gone, she was furious with me. She told me to end it, and I said I would, and then I didn't, because by then I think some part of me had stopped being able to imagine going back to the life I had before. Which terrifies me to say out loud, because I love the life I had before. I love you. Both of those things are true, and I don't know how to make that make sense to you, because it doesn't fully make sense to me either. I couldn't look at the pictures on the fridge from our trip to the lake last year. I started avoiding that side of the kitchen. I'd walk the long way around the island just so I wouldn't have to see your face in that photo, happy, having no idea. That's when I knew how far gone I actually was, when I was rearranging my own house to avoid the evidence of who I used to be. I tried to stop it twice. Once after the coast trip, when Priya confronted me, and once about 10 days ago, when I almost told you myself, right here at this table, and then you asked about my day, and I couldn't do it. I chickened out and asked about your project instead. I've been living in that unfinished sentence ever since. I sat there for a long time without saying anything. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere outside a car alarm went off and stopped. I need time, she said finally, so quietly I almost missed it. I know that's not fair to ask for. I know I don't get to ask you for anything right now, but I don't know what I want if I don't take a beat to actually sit with what I've done instead of just reacting to getting caught. You've had 7 weeks of time, I said. I think I need some too. She started to cry then, not the performative kind, but something quieter and more exhausted, like she'd been holding her breath for 2 months and had finally been allowed to let it out. I know I don't get to ask this, she said, but was there anything I could have said today that would have made this feel different? Or was it always going to end here the moment you found the receipt? I thought about it longer than I expected to. I don't know, I said honestly. I think I needed to hear you say all of it without flinching away from the parts that made you look bad. You did that. It doesn't undo it. But it's not nothing, either. She nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere upstairs a pipe knocked once and went quiet. It was strange, sitting in a kitchen that still looked exactly like it had that morning, knowing that everything underneath it had just been rearranged. I packed a bag that afternoon and stayed with Chris for 4 days. Melissa texted twice, not excuses, just I'm sorry and I know sorry doesn't fix it. And I didn't answer either message, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely didn't know what an honest answer would say. I didn't know it yet, but 4 days at Chris's apartment would turn into something much longer than either of us expected that first night. We tried counseling. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. I didn't walk away the moment the truth came out. Some part of me still believed 7 years could survive 7 weeks, if we were both willing to do the harder work of finding out. Dr. Bennett was calm and unflinching in a way that helped. In the beginning, she had us each describe, without interrupting the other, what the marriage had actually felt like in the year before the nightclub, not the version we told other people, the real one. Melissa talked about feeling invisible in ways she'd never said out loud to me, about routines that had calcified into something neither of us examined anymore. I talked about how much of my trust in her had become a kind of laziness. I'd stopped actively choosing her every day and started assuming the choice had already been made, permanently, years ago, and didn't need tending. That was, I think, the most honest thing either of us said in 6 sessions. A marriage isn't a decision you make once. It's one you keep making, and somewhere in year 5 or 6, I quietly stopped making it and started just assuming it would hold itself together. Marcus texted her twice during that period. She showed me both messages without my asking, an attempt, I think, to prove something to me, or maybe to herself. She didn't respond to either one. I believed her about that, at least. I believe her still. But something had broken that couldn't be counseled back into place. It wasn't the kiss in the parking lot, not really. It was the 7 weeks after it. The folder she didn't delete fast enough. The coast trip built entirely out of a lie to my face. The 10 days she almost told me and chose silence instead. Trust, I learned, isn't broken by a single bad decision. It's broken by the accumulation of small choices to keep protecting the lie instead of ending it. I called it his mistake and hers both, for a while. The fact that I'd let 7 weeks of red flags pass without asking a direct question, because asking felt like an accusation I didn't want to be the kind of husband who made. I don't think that excuses what she did. I've come to understand it isn't about excuses at all. It's about understanding my own part clearly enough that I don't repeat it in whatever comes next. We finalized the separation in the spring. Melissa moved into a small apartment across town. She kept almost nothing from the townhouse, said she needed a space that didn't carry 7 years of a life she'd damaged with her own hands. I heard, through Dana, that she and Marcus never actually became anything real once the affair stopped being a secret. Whatever had drawn them together seemed to need the secrecy to survive, and without it, there wasn't much left standing between them. He'd told his own now former partner about it eventually, apparently, and lost more in the telling than he'd ever admitted he had to lose. I don't know if that's justice, exactly. It's just what happened, and I've stopped needing it to mean more than that. Priya and I still talk sometimes. She apologized again, in person, months later, and told me she still doesn't know if staying quiet as long as she did was loyalty or cowardice. I told her I understood both, and that I didn't need her to resolve it for my benefit. Some people carry an unfinished feeling their whole lives. That's not mine to fix. There was one more conversation with Melissa I haven't mentioned, weeks after the papers were signed. We met for coffee, at her suggestion, somewhere neutral, and she asked if I could ever imagine forgiving her. Not reconciling. She was careful to say, just forgiving as a separate thing. I told her I didn't fully know the difference yet, but that I thought I was getting closer to something that wasn't anger anymore. She said that was more than she'd let herself hope for. We didn't hug goodbye. We shook hands, which felt strange and also exactly right. Two people closing out something that had once been the center of both their lives and now needed to become smaller, more survivable, more like a chapter than a life sentence. Dana, for her part, went through her own divorce finalization around the same time mine did, and there was something almost darkly funny about the two of us commiserating over the same kind of takeout we used to eat with our spouses, now split between 2 smaller apartments instead of one shared table. She told me once that watching my marriage collapse had made her own ending feel less like a personal failure and more like something that simply happens to people sometimes, no matter how carefully they build a life. I didn't know how to tell her that I'd needed to hear that too. I sold the townhouse eventually. I kept the kitchen table, of all things, the one we sat at that Saturday morning. It seemed strange to keep it, and stranger to get rid of it. It's in my new apartment now, and some mornings I sit at it with coffee and don't think about any of this at all, which felt impossible for a long time and now just feels like Tuesday. If there's a lesson in this, and I've turned that word over more than I'd like to admit, it isn't really about Melissa, or Marcus, or even the affair itself. It's about the 11 days I sat on a photo without opening it, and the 7 weeks I spent gathering proof of something I already knew in my body, long before my mind caught up. Somewhere in there is a truth about all of us, how we protect ourselves from certainty far longer than we protect ourselves from pain, because at least uncertainty still lets us hope. I don't hate her. I want to say that plainly, because I think people expect a different ending than that. I loved her for 7 years, and some of those years were real in a way nothing can retroactively undo. What she did doesn't erase that. It just means the story ended somewhere I didn't choose, in a shape I had to learn to accept instead of control. The most painful detail in this story isn't the kiss in the parking lot. It's the 10 days Melissa spent almost telling the truth and choosing silence instead, because that silence is where the real damage accumulated quietly, while both of them kept performing a marriage that had already stopped existing in private. What the story ultimately traces isn't a single betrayal, but a slow accumulation of small, unresolved choices on both sides. Ethan's decision to observe rather than ask, Melissa's decision to justify rather than stop, Priya's decision to protect a friendship instead of a marriage. Each one reasonable in isolation, each one compounding into something none of them could have predicted from the outside. By the time the hotel receipt surfaced, reconciliation wasn't really being blocked by the affair itself. It was blocked by the 7 weeks of deliberate concealment that followed it, the point at which an impulsive mistake calcified into an ongoing decision. Melissa's confession reveals something uncomfortable and human. Guilt didn't function as a warning system. It functioned as evidence she used to reassure herself she hadn't fully become someone else. A self-deception many people recognize even outside the specific shape of an affair. Ethan's growth isn't really about forgiveness or its absence. It's about learning that trust requires ongoing attention rather than a single permanent decision made years earlier and left unexamined. Neither of them emerges as purely villain or victim, which is what makes the ending land as acceptance rather than triumph. Ethan doesn't win anything. He simply stops carrying something that was never his to fix.